nasty business that we had going around in our house for the last however many weeks it's been, or years, or
Feels like.
not even sure anymore. Oh, still lots of people down. I'm assuming Bob and Wendy still got to run from one to their house to the other. Oh, got lots and lots of friends down with it, so let's start with some prayer this morning. Father, we're grateful that we're able to be here this morning. There's been just unbelievable amounts of sickness running around. We're thankful that we're all well enough to be here, but it doesn't remove the fact that we have a lot of brothers and sisters that are still down and seriously ill, Father. Just ask for your mercy, your healing touch to go through the rest of the body, Father. Just lift them up. Heal those that are still suffering. I just thank you now for this time and ask that you'd bless it. Bless us to know you better. In Jesus' name, amen. Oh, yeah, there's been all kinds of stuff going on. I'm trying to think if there's anything too big and urgent. It's been, it's crazy. 3 weeks since I saw you last. You missed 2 weeks of church. It means it's been 3 weeks since I've seen you. So, I think probably the one story I'd like to share with you just from the last week or so. I've got a close friend who's very close with an uncle of his. This friend of mine's dad was a very absent, derelict father, and this uncle pretty much stepped in, and he was his dad. I mean, just, they've been super close the entire life. And anyway, this uncle of his has been just health ups and downs for the last year or two, but he really turned hard for the worse. And I don't remember all exactly the series of events, but ended up in the hospital and having to get surgery to remove some kind of a mass off of a lung, and then ended up with a hole in the lung, and just the last messages I got from my friend Dan, actually he and his family visited here. It was probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago anyway. He had messaged me yesterday and said that just it was time for a Hail Mary, and that they were going in to try and put in some kind of valve so they could hook a breathing tube up and stuff, and that they didn't think the valve was going to work, but that he was going to die without it, and it was really low percentage odds of him even coming out of the surgery, and that if he did come out of the surgery, then they were going to put him on a vent for 2 weeks if he survived that. But anyway, oxygen saturations were just in the tank and just generally abysmal. And Dan had messaged me and just said, "Hey, can you pray?" So I did, and I've been praying for him to stay the last few days, but then I happened to be at a church service yesterday. I got that message about 10 minutes before the prayer service, so I said, "Hey, can we pray?" I got a call from him after I got out of that church service, and he said, "I don't know what miracles look like." He said, "But I got to tell you this." He said, "They took him in, and first off, this hole in his lung, they said there was no fix, and they got in there, they scoped his lungs is what they did, went in, and they said, we think we can 3D print a plug for that." And so that was first thing. And then they got this, so he's got one good lung, one bad lung, and he got him in a good lung, This is what we're wrestling, and you're like, okay, what does miracles look like? And this guy has had a long nicotine habit, and he had smuggled tobacco pouches into the hospital with him. The nurses caught him with them and took them. But apparently he had one that he had hung on to, and somehow fell asleep and inhaled that thing. And it was in his good lung, blocking off half of the lung.
Oh my God.
And they were able to get in there and fish that thing out. And he went into this, we're going in, don't know if this guy's going to make it, and he came out and saying, just radical turnaround.
Wow.
And when Dan called me yesterday afternoon, he said, "I don't know what miracles look like. This seems like such a dumb problem, but this was killing this guy. And they found these problems, and all of a sudden there's actually hope again." And I said, it really, what it made me think about was this, that, when we get calls like that to pray, like, what do you pray for somebody, right? Like, this guy is 70-something years old. He's got all kinds of health problems. When I'm 130, if I get sick, I'm not going to be begging God for more life, right? Like, at some point, all of us is going to go. So what I've been praying for, and that's what I told my friend Dan, I said, I haven't been praying for, God to just miraculously heal your Uncle Steve. What I've been praying for him is, I don't happen to think he knows God, don't have any reason to believe. I said, I've been praying that God gives him the time to get the things settled in his life that he needs to. Right? Like, that's the prayer that I can pray for anybody. I don't care if you're 175 years old, which I understand we got a few million people that age on Social Security, but at any rate, if you're 175, doesn't matter. If you haven't done business with God, I'll pray in full faith and confidence. And that's what I see when I look at this story. I think, like, God gave him more time. And it's what I told Dan. I said, I'm praying that God gives him as much time as he needs to, like, if there's anything in his life that needs to be settled, dealt with, business done with God, that he's given the time that he needs to do that. And it looks like that's what God's done here. So just really, it's one of those, that was a cool day yesterday. Anyhow, so we're working our way through this question of the fall and redemption of man, and we got 2 weeks into it and then had a 2-week delay. Before we get back into it, I was going to mention, speaking of praying, the Wiggles and I are going on a crazy road adventure tomorrow, so Lord willing, the creek don't rise. So y'all think of us at about 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. We're going to be on our way to Louisville, and going to go try and revive another bus that's been sitting in a storage lot down there for 10 years and see if we can drive that sucker home.
Amen.
We're going on a dad and boys adventure.
Would that be a his and her bus?
No, my wife says she ain't set foot in this thing. She saw the videos of what the inside looks like after 10 years of the road and having fun. You know, this is strictly parts machine is all it's supposed to be. But anyway, Wiggles and I are going to take off in the morning and go have us an adventure for a couple days and see if we can limp an old bus 400 or 340 miles back home again. So, anyway. So, we'd made it through the fall of man. Adam, Eve, that whole story, right? So we got through that, and then we got through the story of Noah. And I think, you know, we've kind of seen the trajectory, right? Where man starts off in the garden, everything looks perfect, disobeys the one rule that there is, ends up with separation from God, and then their descendants just descend into chaos. I mean, it's terrible upheaval and debauchery. It's bad, right? And then God comes and says, all right, we're going to just start over with this. We're going to do Noah and his kids. And then we won't go read this story, but you're all familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel. That's what happened next, right? Where God tells them to go out and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, all of that. And they just say, no, we're going to hang out together. And then God has to throw some more confusion and scrambling into the mix. This is all part of this story of what gets us to today. But then the next spot that I actually want to go look at, because I want to highlight more than the reason I'm not going to the Tower of Babel story is I'm not so much wanting to look at all the failings of humankind, right? Because we got lots of those. I'm more wanting to look at the highlights where God comes along and has a conversation with humanity. That's what I'm really trying to focus on is what is it that God's been trying to communicate with us ever since the garden? Like, what's he trying to tell us? And I think the next story that does the best job of exemplifying that's over here in Genesis chapter 22. And I want to go look at this today, and this is the story of Abraham and his son Isaac. And this story has always been one that just baffles and confounds me in many ways. And as a matter of fact, even more so now that I've got kids, as I read this story, and I just think, like, how do I make sense out of this? Genesis chapter 22. So, Abraham has been obedient to God and everything he's told him to do up until now, right? Like, he's left Ur of the Chaldees, gone to the land of Canaan. Now, he has not been perfect. He's done some pretty dumb stuff, like wandered off down to Egypt and lied about his wife, and then when the promise isn't fulfilled fast enough, then, well, okay, maybe we'll just have this whole Hagar and Ishmael thing. And so he's not perfect. It's just that at the points at which God has confronted him or encountered him and said, here's what I want from you, he says yes. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Like, I don't think, I know better. We cannot find a human being in the Bible that if you go read their story, there aren't some serious flaws in it. Matter of fact, that's one of the things that convinces me of the truth of this book, is because Most of the times when you've got great religious heroes in different religions, they're pretty fond of telling you all the things they do right, not the things they do wrong. And this book isn't bashful about telling us about the things that our forebears have done wrong. But at its core, what was it that Abraham had that was unique is that he was faithful to following God when God asked hard stuff of him. And the ultimate hard stuff is what happens here in Genesis 22. So let's read this together. It says, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. What's the after these things? He's had Ishmael born, then Isaac born, then he's had to send Ishmael away along with Hagar, and it really tore him up. That was his kid. And God said, no, that was your plan. We've got to go with my plan. So all that stuff has transpired. And then God says to him, Abraham, and he says, Here I am. And then it goes on, it says, Then he said to him, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. You know, let's just stop and think about this a minute. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you and say that if I was convinced that I thought this is what I was hearing, I would go check myself into pine rest. Let's just be honest. Like that's what my reaction. You know what? If I hear voices and they tell me take your kid and kill him, I'm going to be like, I clearly need to get put in a straitjacket. So I don't think that I would start this by saying, okay, if somebody comes to me in church and says, I got to call like Abraham, no, I'm not going along with that. And if I had been Abraham's friend back then, I'd been like, buddy, you are definitely tripping out. And I think the important thing to remember is that God sees the big picture. And no, I don't think he's in the habit of giving instructions like this. He gives instructions that are specific to the people that are getting them. And we've talked about it, we'll probably get into it a little bit in the process, but I think Moses is probably another great example of this, where, he's another fantastic character with enormous strength and fortitude. And I know I've mentioned this before, but you know what's special about all these guys is that God knows exactly how to test them. And the way he tested Moses was by giving him about 5 million people is the estimate, who grumbled and complained, and that's what it took to break him. And he cracked and smacked a rock and screamed at it. Anything less than that, Moses was a saint. It took 5 million obnoxious people to get him to the end of himself. And I'm convinced that's what God's doing, and that's an important element of all of what we're reading here. I think it's important to understand it because I think he's going to do the same thing in your lives and my life too. He knows exactly what will get you to the end of you. Now, he doesn't do it with the purpose of just making you miserable. He does it with the purpose of, it's really easy for me to think I've got my act all together when there's nothing upsetting happening, right? Like, I can keep my temper and a smile on my face and say nice, pleasant things to everybody all the time. If my bank account's full and I never get sick and my car never breaks and my roof never leaks, I'm an awesome person with all of that in place. But when things start breaking down and falling apart, and when challenging stuff happens, that's when it's not that God needs to figure out what's inside of us. He never does. He knows what's inside. It's that he wants us to know what's inside of us so that we're in a better spot to learn how to trust him more, how to deal with the stuff that needs to get cleaned out. That's the point of testing. It's for our sake, not for his. So this falls in that kind of a category where he knew, just think about this once, right? Abraham's 100 years old. His whole life he's wanted a son. Wasn't going to have one. When God has that conversation back with him, when the angels show up, and he says, this servant of mine is going to inherit me. And God says, no, he's not. And then he gets to like I said, we get the Ishmael thing. He's like, wow, I got a kid. And then God's like, no, not that kid, this kid. So we get to this, and you got to look at this through Abraham's eyes, and you realize, finally, I've got the thing, right? Like, you can have all the amazing stuff in the world, but there is something saying, I got a kid. He's like, I finally got a kid. He's a good kid. He's going to take over when I'm gone. Then God says, oh, by the way, here, I want you to come sacrifice that kid. And I just want you to think about once. Now, he's been in the habit of having face-to-face conversations with God. So that's an important element of this. Like, this isn't him going, I kind of think I had this little nudge and this little fuzzy feeling inside. Like, this is Abraham doesn't have to question when God talks to him, right? Like, you and I might wrestle with that. Like, I don't know about you, I have not heard the audible voice of God. So if I had heard a voice that said this, I would definitely be wrestling. Is this God talking to me? But in Abraham's instance, there's no question. He's heard God's voice repeatedly, starting Ur of the Chaldees, get thee out of thy father's house and out of the nation and go to the land of Canaan. All down to this, God has spoke to him. So when this voice says, take your son, your only son Isaac, and sacrifice him, one of the questions he has is not, is this God talking? He knows it's God talking. It's just a question, the one that I'm sure going through his head is, why? But the part that's astounding is what he does. Says, take him, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. In verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning. This one just blows my mind, because I think if I had instructions like this, I feel like it'd take me a little longer than like bright and early the next morning to get on it. I mean, I might be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to do that thing you told me to, God. Maybe next week or next year, next month, whatever it is. But Abraham hears what God tells him. And the very next day, he's packing it on the road. It says, rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. This is part of the story that just blows my mind. So it took him 3 days. Can you even imagine what this journey was like? You think about how long it seems like it takes to get to places, but now imagine you've got 3 days. And this isn't 3 days in a car where you've got the air conditioning on the radio. This is 3 days on a donkey. Well, donkey carrying gear, and you probably on foot is what you've actually got. 3 days of traipsing along where I don't know how much you've traveled by foot or at slow speed, but it's like the horizon just never moves, right? We talk about that when you're crossing the Great Plains in the car and you see the Rocky Mountains, for half a day away. But this is a whole nother level of that, where that spot on the horizon doesn't change for hours and hours on end, and all you've got is 3 days straight of journey to think about what you're going to go do. I'm going to give up. I'm going over there and sacrifice them, and I'm coming back without it. Right? Like, this is crazy stuff. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to the young men, stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So this is where this gets interesting. So he says, we will go, we'll worship, and we'll come back to you. What is Abraham saying here? You see what his instruction was, right? His instruction was go sacrifice your son. So is he lying to his young men to cover the nature of what it is that he thinks he's supposed to do? What is going on here? And I forgot to put it in my notes, but Paul says in the epistles, his interpretation was that Abraham reckoned that God was able to raise his son from the dead. That his explanation is that Abraham went and was doing this because he absolutely believed the promise of God. Now this is where it gets crazy. He takes it back that Abraham has so much faith in what God had told him. Because remember, there's no question in his mind about the voice of God. And God told him, through Isaac, your descendants will be reckoned. God told him that. And so Abraham had looked at this whole process and said, there's only one possible explanation. God is asking me to sacrifice my son because God is going to raise my son from the dead. So he wasn't lying to the servants when he said this, but still, this whole thing, you think about, okay, in my mind it feels a little bizarre, but you think about what he's looking at this, the lens he's looking at through is a level of faith that's beyond mine. God gave me a son, God's asked me to sacrifice a son, and God's going to give me the son back. This is faith in God's entire plan and in the things he said. And I guess I'm going to be honest, I don't have this level of faith. But it definitely is a challenge to me to say, when I'm convinced that God is doing something in my life, and convinced that I see a chunk of the plan, do I have so much faith that I believe God brings it to completion, or do I try and help it along the way? Right? That's something I've been very guilty of in the past. I'm okay, I'm convinced this is what God wants to do. And it's a lesson I've had to learn the hard way over and over, that's, okay, if God is actually doing something, it doesn't need my help, it just needs my submission and commitment. If it's really him doing it, and I'll tell you, I have argued this case with a few people that are running ministries where they'll be like, doing these. They'll, for one hand, tell me like, yep, God's called me to do this. This is one of my big challenges. We'll get a little bit of one of my pet peeves here. I really object to most big fundraisers for religious work, for God's work. And the reason is because I say, well, is God actually doing it, or are you actually doing it? Like, if you're going to tell me, like, God's called me to feed these orphans, or God's called me to do that, but then you've got all these ways you're working so hard to make the budget work, and I go, who's doing that job? Or how many of you have read, if you haven't, go read George Mueller's story. Raised 10,000 orphans in England without ever asking anybody for a dime. Because one day God told him to take care of orphans. And I go, I believe that guy. I believe that God told him to do that. So, that's the kind of faith, though, that Abraham's walking in here. So he says, stay here. We'll go yonder and worship and come back to you. Verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. This is the most poignant thing I can just imagine in this. Literally carrying the wood for his own sacrifice, right? Like, I just can't even imagine the mental picture. I'm Abraham trudging along and watching. We don't know how old he was, young man, teen, carrying the wood for his own offering. Like, I couldn't, like, my knees would have buckled, and I'd have just, I'm sorry, God, like, I'm not walking this path. I can't do it. You're asking too much. I'm not going up on that mountain. I'm just being honest, like, I'm pretty sure that's where I'd ended up. Says, laid it on his son Isaac, and he took the fire in his hand. He didn't carry fire in his hand. He carried a pot, probably, with some coals, and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Kid says, Dad, what are we going to sacrifice? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there, and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. I don't know what their relationship was like. We don't know how old Isaac was. I say general assumption is probably in his teens at this point. I've got to believe that at some point, we don't have this chronicle, that Abraham's like, all right, here's what we're actually up here for. Like, here's what God told me to do. And this is a whole other level of, we're not even just discussing the faith of Abraham. At some point here, we're discussing the faith of Isaac. Where his dad says, God told me to come up here and do this. And, I mean, most kids I know at any age would be like, catch me if you can. I'm going to go back down the mountain with them two guys down there and tell them, my dad lost it on top of that mountain. Like, he's off his nut. And yet Isaac is still here in this part of the story. It says, laid him on it, verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. You notice he says the same exact thing. In Hebrew, this is hineni. Here I am. It's the response. It's interesting. It's a servant response. It isn't just here I am. It's here I am with intent to obey. Hineni. So back at the beginning of this story, God says Abraham, and Abraham says hineni. And he gets these instructions. And it gets him up to here. And he's standing on top of the mountain, knife in hand. And the angel, now we tend to think angel's big winged creature. I want you to remember that angel in Hebrew literally means messenger. Okay? And yes, angelic being, but messenger in this sense is literally the voice of God. Okay? Like this very much is God speaking through a being here. And says, Abraham. And Abraham says, hineni. And I want you to just think about all that's transpired in between. If there was a point at which Abraham had the right to say, what do you want now? Right? Like that's, to be honest with you, we get to this point in the story, and I'm afraid that my response to these circumstances would be like, really? Here I am. I'm about about to do this thing you told me to do. Now what do you want? Instead, Abraham responds the same way he did before he knew anything God was going to ask him. He says, here I am. Hineni. Verse 12, when he said, do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So I want you to just think about, what did this moment look like? Yeah, I mean, Abraham, I see him, falling in a pile, right? Oh my goodness. But then to realize, God just walked me to the edge of the precipice, and I didn't let go. What does your faith look like after you go right to the very ragged edge of what God tells you to do, and then God's the one, not you. You don't say, okay, I can't go anymore, I got to stop now. What's it like to walk so far with God that he finally says, you've walked far enough? When's the last time you had that in your life, right? Where instead of being okay, God, we need to kind of take a break now. He says, you know what? This is it. You've reached the edge. And I see Abraham kind of staggered and falling down a minute. Who knows what was going through Isaac's head? But can you even imagine the kind of experience it is for Isaac even to be standing there, knife raised, and we don't know if he heard the previous conversation, but he heard this one. Can you imagine what it's like to hear the angel of God say, now I know you trust me 100%. You've not withheld anything from me, even your son. Can you imagine the kind of mark that leaves on your kid for the rest of their life when they see you do exactly what God told you to? This is the kind of stuff that money can't buy. Verse 13, it says, and Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Remember what he told his son? God will provide the offering. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I've sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son, blessing, I will bless you. And multiplying, I will multiply you. And multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of your enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. I want you to think about the significance of what he says there. When he says that, in you, in your seed, literally in your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Do you understand that this is where the promise that the Messiah would come from Abraham's descendants comes from? That when he went up on top of the mountain with his son and said, God, I am willing to give you everything. All my plans, my hopes, my dreams, I'm willing to put all of that, because that's literally what Isaac represented to him. I mean, at this point, he's an old man. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to live. This is his only son. Everything he's ever built and worked for represented that son. And he took all of it and he laid it on the altar. And he says, God, you have every bit of it. And God says, now because you've done this, the blessing that's going to result from this is going to reverberate down. You understand, this is crazy, but where we sit today in this church building with our relationship with God, the trajectory of that story starts right here with Abraham on top of the mountain. If he'd have said no, I don't know what the story would have done. God would have found some fix, but we would have a totally different story for how we got restored to God than if Abraham had refused to do what he was told to here. It says in verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. So this is another one of those marker points where God reveals parts of the attributes that he has and parts of his character. Now, did God ever actually want to see Isaac sacrificed? No, God didn't. I want you to take a step back and think about there's no purpose served in literally sacrificing Isaac. God wasn't looking for that. What he was looking for was Abraham to follow him so completely. Remember, Jesus talks about this. Says, anyone who does not hate father, mother, brother, children, yes, even his own life, cannot be my disciple. See, this type of faith that Jesus was talking about is exactly what Abraham was exhibiting. Where Abraham was willing to follow God to the total abandonment of everything else. And you understand what he's exhibiting here is exactly what God wanted out of Abraham back in the garden, right? Like that, walking in the garden, doing what God told him to do, like Abraham, I would suggest, is exemplifying something that was unique in Noah, where Noah says was righteous in his generations, and he was willing to go be made the laughingstock of the world for 100 years. Think about that once. That's what's unique in his character. It took him 100 years to build the ark, for 100 years in which nobody had ever heard of such a thing as a flood. He built a boat on dry ground. I mean, ridiculed and mocked, we're told in other places. And kept right at it. He sacrificed his entire reputation, the reputation of his family, for 100 years to be obedient to God. And now Abraham goes up on a mountain and sacrifices everything that is important to him for the sake of being obedient to God. You start to see a pattern here. What God has always wanted out of humanity, even before the fall, this isn't unique to the fall, it's just we're getting back to it, is people that walk with him. It's never been about sacrifices. It's never been about offerings. What God has always been about is a relationship with human beings where we walk together, we talk together, and he says, you know, I got this thing that I'd like to do. And we say, let me in. I want to be a part of that. So now let's go take a look over at Exodus. We're going to get over to Exodus chapter 19. We'll get into this a little bit today, but probably not real deep. Because all of a sudden we start seeing all kinds of stuff. So God led the Israelites. We know the story. He promised Abraham that his descendants were going to go and they were going to be enslaved 430 years in Egypt, like he told them that in advance. They go down there. They basically all but forget God. And ultimately, God takes Moses, leads them back out of there. And they find their way through all kinds of hardships and tribulations. And right now, they've been through the Red Sea. They've seen the armies of Pharaoh destroyed. And now they've made it to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. So Exodus 19 says, in the third month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, so we've had 3 months of them freed from slavery, which this is kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about it much before I was preparing for this message, but it's not a lot of time really. Right? Like 3 months is, especially if you're busy and stuff's going on. I mean, can you even imagine the radical change? They went from, we are slaves in Egypt, to Mount Sinai in 3 months. And then, even before that, it's a whirlwind, right? Like, they've seen just crazy stuff. They've seen plagues and just affliction, hailstorms and lightning and death of tons of people in Egypt. I mean, they've seen Egypt, the most powerful kingdom in the world at the time, just decimated. And God brought them out of there and then watched the armies wiped out in the Red Sea, right? And so then they get to Mount Sinai. 3 months later, it says in verse 2, for they departed from Rephidim and come to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. You understand what the conversation that God's having with the nation of Israel here is exactly the kind of conversation that he was having with Noah and then with Abraham, except for the first time ever, he's having it with an entire group of people. That's what just changed. But this conversation that he's having is one that looks just like with him, like he's saying, I want to be your God. I've demonstrated it by snatching you out of Egypt. You've seen what I can do. And now I want you to walk with me. Then in verse 6 he goes on and says, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. You notice, I want you to just think about this once. We tend to think of the Old Testament as rules and regulations and sacrifices and all that stuff. But do you see what God actually says to the nation of Israel when he first says, all right, he hasn't apparently had a big conversation with him before now, right? Like he's just been busy delivering them. He hasn't had a big, okay, here's what I want from you sort of conversation. But what he says to them, you saw what he did. Now therefore, if you'll indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me, nation of priests and kings. He just says, you guys in? You interested in this? I want you to be my people if you'll keep my covenant. Now I want you to notice something. The Old Testament law wasn't given yet. How did they understand this when he says covenant? They understood it in the context of Abraham. They understood it in the context of Noah, where God had taken people in the past and said, here's what I want. And they just said yes. They aren't thinking, okay, 613 laws given on a mountain. They're just thinking about our forebears, our ancestors have walked with God. Now God's asking us if an entire nation are interested in doing that. Verse 7, it says, so Moses came and called for the elders of Israel and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I come to you in the thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. So this is interesting. So the people say, yep, we're in, we're going to do this. And then Moses relays that to God. What's interesting is I'm quite certain God had already heard it. Moses is being an intermediary, but in some ways an unnecessary one at this point. And shares this with God. And then God says something interesting. He says, come to you that the people may hear that I speak with you. It strikes me of the similarities between what happened with Isaac when he heard God speak with his father Abraham. And here we've got God saying, I want the people to hear us talking. I don't want them to ever be able to make the mistake of thinking that Moses cooked this up, is what they're saying. Like, want to hear it in the first person, not just Moses relaying the information. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow. Whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not come near your wives. This isn't saying their wives were evil, by the way. They're just supposed to be very focused on, we're going to the presence of God. He says, this isn't time for good old times. Like, we're setting everything in time. We're fasting. We're washing up. We're getting cleaned up because we are going to be serious about spending time with God. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. This whole picture, this is one of my favorite mental pictures in the entire Bible. Like, just picture this. Black cloud, just swirling cloud on top of the mountain, and lightning and thundering striking, and then over top of that, the sound of a trumpet blast so loud that you can hear it over top of the raging storm that's going on top of the mountain. And the mountain is quaking and shaking to its roots. Why? It's because the mountain is part of the creation, and the God that created it is coming down on this mountain. Like, it's got the very laws of physics quaking to their core. When it says the people were shaking, that's nothing like literally the laws that govern our universe were shaking in the presence of their Creator. It says, verse 17, and Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because God descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. You even picture this, like the people are all spread out. Here's Moses standing at the base of the mountain, people behind him, and he says, God, here we are. And it doesn't really say a lot about just this answer to him by voice. So we've got thunderings, lightnings, trumpet blast, and now God speaks over that. Then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. I'm not sure what kind of bold soul that would be, but God's like, make sure they understand this. I'm thinking, if I'm that person at the base of the mountain, I'm going to be pretty well glued to the spot where I'm standing. It says, also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. It's interesting. He's saying, even the priests, let's make sure, you make sure they have got themselves squeaky clean. Because even they aren't safe from the presence of God if they are breaking his rules. But Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain, consecrate it. Then the Lord said to him, away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So I want you to just think about this picture a little bit, and then perhaps what's going on here. So does God know what's in our hearts? The answer is absolutely yes. Getting back to where I started with this, that whole question of why does God test us? To find out what's inside of us. And you understand he's doing exactly that with the nation of Israel here? The reason he's being so specific with Moses about all this is because he knew full well that there was rebellion in these people's hearts. I mean, I want you to think about when he says, let the priest consecrate them. Remember, what? 2 of Aaron's sons get smoked not long after this because their hearts weren't right. All of these things that God's saying, he's not saying them just idly, just in case. God knew what was in there. And the whole point of all of this that we're reading here isn't so that God can figure out, I'm using my air quotes here, figure out if the children of Israel are going to obey him. It's so that he can reveal to them their own hardness of heart and their own failings in theirs. So then Moses comes down to the people after he's had this first initial encounter, and he gives them what's called the 10 Commandments. And I have a pretty strong theory that if the children of Israel had had hearts that were genuinely turned to obeying God, I think this is the only written instructions they would have got at Mount Sinai. I don't know that for certainty, but I strongly suspect it. Because if we look at the example of how God's walked with people all prior to that history, and then look at what he's done with the sacrifice of his son Jesus, where it says, what, you'll be led by the Spirit. I think that's exactly what he already wanted for them. The only reason, and it says this, we'll look at it probably next week, we'll get into Hebrew, but it says that the law was given because of the hardness of your hearts. So when we look at this 10 Commandments, I'm convinced that what God was giving them was a basic framework that said, here's the terms and conditions of a relationship, and that the rest of it only follows when they're unable to accept this with a whole heart. So let's read through this a minute, and then we'll probably quit today with just the 10 Commandments in mind, and we'll pick back up next week. It says, and God spoke all these words, saying, this is Moses comes down the mountain with us, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So he lays down ground rules, and he says, I am the one. 3 months I've been doing this. You've witnessed this. And then he lays out his demands, righteous decrees. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, You speak with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. Right here, the children of Israel, I'm convinced, had a choice to make. And the choice was either to say, there's something inside of me that does not want to be in the presence of God, and say that. Like, I think that would have been the better option. Just that there's something here that needs fixing. Like, I'm scared of God in a way that I shouldn't be. It's not a holy fear, it's a terror of judgment, righteous retribution. And he said, You speak with us. And Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to you to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. So he says, No, you come up here. And you notice they standing back there. They say, No, we can't. And ultimately, God ends up agreeing with them, and that's probably one of the saddest agreements in there, where he ends up saying, like, yeah, you're right. They should stay down there and you should come up here. And then he starts giving out the entire law. That's what follows here. So at this point in history, we're going to get into it more next week with the discussion of, what does the law mean to us? Like, what did it mean to the children of Israel? What does it mean to us? Like, why did God give it? And I want to really, next week, dive into that question. Like, get into the New Testament. Take a look and say, how does this interweave itself with this story? But at its core, I think the biggest takeaway we get from all of this, and the thing that's most important to us where we're at in history, is this concept that what God has always been after was people to just walk with him. That just say, I want to hold your hand, and I want to go where you want to go, and I don't care what it costs, because walking with you is more valuable, more important than anything else that I can get in this life. Like, it might seem oversimplified, but as far as I can tell, that really is what the entire story of a creation and fall of man is about, is that God's just looking for beings, human beings, that want to walk with him and do what he wants to do and revel in his presence, I think would be the way I'd put it. And we'll look at that some more next week, the question then of how this law thing ties in, and just as kind of a little teaser to that, one of the things that really, to me, convinces me that this wasn't ever meant to be the all-encompassing thing in this Old Testament law is the fact that it's not all of it. That the Old Testament law doesn't cover every question that you could possibly have, right? Like, it's just enough to bring the guilt of sin. That's what God finally gave them. He gave them just enough instructions, just the perfect amount, so that it could trip any man in his argument that I'm good enough, that I've done enough, that no human being has ever been able to take the Old Testament law and walk it out perfectly. And that's exactly what God intended with it. If he gave us the whole law, I want you to think about that once. There is no separation between God's physical law and his spiritual law. We think of it that way. We think of the laws of gravity, and then we think of the laws of Old Testament dietary laws. And God doesn't work that way. Do you think God's compartmentalized and that he's got here's the laws that I wrote that govern how the universe works, and then here's the laws? No, there's no separation. There is no physical, secular side of God and then a spiritual side. That's bogus. He made the universe, and the spiritual and the physical laws are all completely in harmony with each other. And so if he had given the nation of Israel all of his law, do you understand it would have been like all the laws of quantum mechanics and everything else, like way beyond their comprehension, along with an enormous mass of laws. Like, He has a law, if you want to call it that governs every single decision that you make every day of your life. And if he'd have put that all in writing, I'm telling you, like, remember it says about Jesus that if all the things that he did had been written down, the universe could not contain the books thereof? Well, imagine now if God sits down and says, we're going to write the book of everything ever. That's what he's doing. It's called eternity. So the point of this, spoiler alert, is that it was another tool, that everything God's been doing up to now is another tool to basically nudge us and bump us and say, are you getting the message yet? Have you got the hint of what it is that I want from you yet? Let's end with prayer and then the blessing this morning. Father, we just thank you for these words that have so long ago been written down. I thank you that you've given us some glimpses into what it means, and I ask that you'd just show us how to make application of it in our lives. Thank you now that we've been able to gather here, and I ask again that you would continue to bring healing to the rest of our brothers and sisters so that they can come back and gather with us again as well. I just thank you for life. In Jesus' name, amen. Share the blessing together. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom.